Good morning, everyone. Hello, welcome. Hi, I'm Maria Mumtaz, and on behalf of Sharjah Art Foundation, I would like to welcome you to the 15th edition of March Meeting, which convenes this year under the banner of the Postcolonial Constellation, Art, Culture, Politics after 1960, and coincides with 30 years of Sharjah Biennial to discuss vital issues revolving around SB 15's overarching theme, Thinking Historically in the Present. March Meeting 2023 builds on the two previous iterations of the meeting, the Afterlives of the Postcolonial in 2022 and Unraveling the Present 2021, that were similarly conceived as part of SB 15 programming in relationship to the late Enwezor's conception of the postcolonial constellation. Thank you for joining us here today. It's a great pleasure to be able to welcome our guest speakers, many of whom have flown from far corners of the globe, and some who will be joining us via Zoom or pre-recorded presentations. This edition of March Meeting includes 4 keynotes and 8 panel discussions over the course of the next few days. I would like to start with a little housekeeping before we begin today's program. Please note that all sessions are in English and simultaneous translation is available in Arabic. Translation headsets can be collected at the entrance of the hall. Tea, coffee, and lunch will be provided throughout the day. We also have a reading room and book display in the room outside the hall for the duration of the conference. Before we start, I would like to welcome to stage President and Director of Sharjah Art Foundation and Curator of Sharjah Biennial 15, Hur Al-Qasimi, to give welcome remarks.
Thank you, Maria. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to March Meeting 2023, the Postcolonial Constellation, Art, Culture, Politics after 1960. This edition concludes the 3-year cycle of meetings conceived to explore Enwezor's concept of the postcolonial constellation as part of the programming around the current Sharjah Biennial 15, Thinking Historically in the Present. Over the next 4 days, March Meeting 2023 will examine a multitude of artistic, political, and cultural positions alongside questions that have emerged across post-colonial contexts from the 1960s to the present. By engaging with these ever-present colonial and post-colonial histories that have shaped present-day realities, we hope to further a collective understanding of the contemporary global moment and its precarity, struggle, and ferment. Through these and other issues addressed by artists whose works are on view in this biennial, MM23 will explore the dynamic intersection of contemporary art, neoliberal politics, and global modernism, and its bearing on how art is produced, practiced, and received around the world. It's such a pleasure to welcome this very diverse audience of artists, art professionals, academics, and members of our local community who are joining us here today. I'd also like to extend a special welcome to the several university and curatorial study groups from around the world who have traveled here to participate. We hope their experiences, both within the sessions and in their conversations with other attendees, will prove fruitful. After all, these young people will be the future of cultural production. I'd like to thank the SB 15 Working Group, Dr. Salah Hassan, Chika Okeke Agulu, Utameta Bauer, Octavia Zaya, and Tara Abul Futuh for their thoughtful contributions to the programming of this event. My sincerest thanks, of course, goes to our speakers, those present with us, as well as those who are unable to travel. The March Meeting would not have been possible without the generous support of the Terra Foundation for American Art and the International Biennial Association. I'd like to express my deepest gratitude to these two organizations for their faith in the work that we do. It's also an honor to introduce the distinguished art historian Terry Smith, who will give our opening keynote address, Renewing African Art Discourse Within the Postcolonial Constellation. Among his many accolades, Terry Smith is Emeritus Professor of Art History at the University of Sydney, and Andrew W. Mellon, Emeritus Professor of Contemporary Art History and Theory in the Department of the History of Art and Architecture at the University of Pittsburgh. He's professor in the Division of Philosophy, Art, and Critical Thought at the European Graduate School and Faculty at Large, Curatorial Program, School of Visual Arts, New York. He is also the editor of the much-anticipated The Enwezor Reader, a 2-volume series in tribute to the late curator, critic, and theorist. The Reader is published by Duke University Press on behalf of the Africa Institute and Sharjah Art Foundation. Thank you all for joining us as we gather for this 15th edition of our annual March Meeting and the 15th edition of the 30th anniversary of Sharjah Biennial. Please join me in welcoming Terry Smith, who will also have time for a Q&A after his presentation. Thank you.
Well, it's wonderful to be here. Thanks very much, Paul Al-Qasimi, for your wonderful welcome. The whole Art Foundation has been fantastically welcoming to all of us. Thanks particularly to Salah Hassan and Satan Al-Hassan and Maria Mumtaz from the Africa Institute. Thanks to Chika for being involved in inviting me to, along with Oakwood's invitation, to put together this book that we'll be telling you about in a moment. I've particularly enjoyed meeting, again, many colleagues. I've had some fantastic conversations already here. So I'm thanking everybody for that. What I'm now doing is looking for the, there it is, the remote. Okay. So we know Enwezor best for the important exhibitions that he curated or co-curated during his extraordinarily productive career. We rightly celebrate such landmark shows as the Second Johannesburg Biennale, Trade Routes, History and Geography in 1997, the Short Century, Independence and Liberation Movements in Africa, 1945 to 1944, which was done in 2001. Documenter 11 inspired this whole operation here, 2002. Intense Proximity, an anthology of the near and the far in Paris in 2012. All the World's Futures, the 56th International Art Exhibition in Venice, 2015, and Post-War Art Between Pacific and the Atlantic, 1945 to 65, done in 2016. All those dates are about thinking historically in the present. They're not just there for decoration or just to mark out art historical moments. But less known to everybody are his achievements, I think, as an art critic, as an art historian, particularly of photography, particularly African photography. His work as a theorist of post-colonialism matches anyone's work in that area, and his work as a university-based public educator. Now, the writings that make all this clear are scattered through many different formats, mostly exhibition catalogues, magazines, journals, several chapters in books, introductions to edited books, but also occasional publications, pamphlets, printed lectures, panel discussions, and postings online. Between 1993 and his untimely death in 2019, he published 70 journal articles and catalogue essays on artists, on individual artists, conducted 36 interviews with artists, many of whom are here, wrote several important art historical and critical essays, as well as many occasional pieces, over 200 in all. His one standalone book, Contemporary African Art Since 1980, published in 2009, co-authored with his dear friend and colleague, Chika Okeke Agulu. As Chika will attest, Okwe and he often used to kid me about my own output, and I would reply, it's actually no more than yours, it's just concentrated in books. So that's what brings up first why I'm speaking, my relationship with Okwe. We first met as members of the curatorial team for Global Conceptualism, Points of Origin, 1950s to 80s, curated by Louis Kamnitzer, Jane Farver, and Rachel Weiss for the Queen's Museum in 1999. Subsequently, at my invitation, he became a visiting professor at the University of Pittsburgh from 2003 to 6, a highlight being the conference which Nancy Condi and I and he put together led to the book that you see here, Antinomies of Art and Culture, from Duke in 2008, Duke University Press, 2008. He invited me to participate in some of his exhibitions, many of which we talked about, not least the second Bienal de Sevilla in 2007 and in post-war. Several other projects. We shared much of our work in progress, particularly in the early 2000s. His constant contact enriched my thinking and my life immeasurably, as it's done for many in this room. So during what turned out to be his fatal illness, we often discussed the fact that, despite his voluminous writings, over 1 million words, there was no one place where a reader might go to gain a sense of the evolution of his main concerns and of the comprehensiveness of his thought. 3 years before he died, as we sat in his room in a Munich hospital, when he first started to register that maybe this was it, he asked me to bring a place to look at his work into being. So we discussed in general terms what such a volume might be like, but he entrusted me entirely with the selection, for which I take full responsibility. Oakley was not into managing his afterlife, as many of you will know. Instead, he concentrated on making those last years as productive as they could be. Indeed, he kept up with his many ongoing projects, even taking on new ones, pretty much until a few days before the end, as we can attest. So, this is what we'll be talking about today. The reader. The reader will have 2 volumes. Be published by Duke University Press through the good offices of Ken Wissaker. Published for the Africa Institute, as Hall said, of the Art Foundation. I've selected 32 from amongst, as I said, the 200 published works. All of them will be listed in a bibliography compiled by Ihan Ozan, who is here in the front row. Itself an invaluable resource. We'll put that at the end of Volume 1. We hope to have the books ready for this event. That was the plan. But it took time to track down all the illustrations. There are disruptions to the supply chain, as you all know. So we're aiming for later this year. So in my remarks today, I'll reflect on the experience of editing these texts, selected from amongst his prodigious published output of, as I said, over 1 million words. And I hope, when you read these volumes, you'll see that they constitute an achievement that match his exhibitions, even as they're inseparable from them. So, making the selection. As I began to look through Oakley's writings, my first thought was to organize them according to genre. Obviously, famous essays introducing much discussed exhibitions, the black box for Documenta, followed by some influential essays on more general topics, such as the Postcolonial Constellation of 2003, or mega exhibitions, the antinomies of a transnational global form, also 2000. So, as well as those essays that profile world historical developments, notably the changes in African culture. So finally, I thought examples of his many essays on individual artists. That would make a substantial volume. But as I read further, I realized that this structure was reproducing what international art worlds and the world's geopolitical configurations were demanding of Oakley, not what he was demanding of them. Not the challenges he was putting before us. I saw that the arc of his intellectual life served 2 overriding ambitions. First, to found and sustain a new African art discourse. And second, to urge a critical Africanist diasporic imagining of post-coloniality on that discourse. I realized that the first ambition drove him during the 1990s and the early 2000s, and that the relative success of that effort emboldened him to pursue it on a bolder, wider, world-changing scale, which he did from the later 2000s until 2019. So the 2 volumes came from that realization as much as they did from the practical factors. If you've got 32 essays, you've got to put them in at least two, but you can't fit them all in one great big chunk. So I think his success has occurred not least because of the work he put into enlisting the help of many others, including many people in this room and many who will look at this webcast. I hope, as I describe what's going into the volumes, you'll recognise aspects of your own journey through these years as I discuss the evolution of his thinking between the two volumes as they stand now. So let's begin with the first part, with Renewing African Art Discourse. Obviously, the front cover of NKA Art, Journal of African Art, Fall-Winter 1994. Let me take the water. All of Oakwy's activities served this clearly stated, proudly held, combative agenda. Renew African art, its practices, its theorization, its reception, its institutionalization, the writing of its histories, in other words, as Foucault would say, its discourse. By African, he meant art made on the continent, of course, but also that made by members of its diaspora, especially African American artists and black artists in Britain, the Caribbean, and in Europe. The diasporic imagination, as Magdalena will know, was a phrase that he often used to mark the nature and scope of the psychosocial field within which contemporary African art was being made, the psychosocial field. Well-versed in current theorizations of postmodernity, he constantly sought to ground them in the experience of mid-century struggles for independence and against the legacies of slavery. He drew deeply on the theorizations of post-coloniality that emerged from these experiences. Great thinkers still occurring. Fanon, Achille Mbembe, it's still happening. For him, these struggles were the most important drivers of modern history and continued to shape the contemporary present. They were, he believed, decisive for artists of the diaspora. So in the editorial to this journal, the inaugural issue, he introduces himself as a writer and poet, publisher and editor of the journal, founded with Salah Hassan, who's here, and Chika Okeke-Agulu. It's entitled Redrawing the Boundaries Towards a New African Art Discourse. So that's obviously the title of our first volume. The essay sets out a quest that he would pursue for the rest of his life that would inform every aspect of his work, no matter what the extensive topic. It's one of the first of his essays to appear in print, May the 1st. It's launched in Brooklyn, in New York, a journal devoted to African art. He begins precisely and presently from inside the apparent contradiction. He's close to the heart of power, provoked by a vacuum within it. I quote him, "One of the problematic aspects of visiting museums, art galleries, and other sites of cultural evaluation in Europe and in the United States is the pervasive absence in these highly policed environments of art by contemporary African artists." He rages against attitudes such as those expressed by Susan Vogel when she writes, quote, her, "Contact with the West has been the determining influence for African art in the 20th century." William Rubin's famous 1984 exhibition, Primitivism, Affinities, Tribal and Modern, he called a primitivist cultural festival. He's furious about the utter failure in the West to recognise the fact that the reverse has been occurring since 1906, obviously since Picasso used African masks in demoiselles. Routinely regarded as the breakthrough moment of 20th century modernism. He condemns actually in equal terms African artists and writers appealing to a kind of racial essentialism. He was against that. Instead, he says, and I quote, "If an artist like Anatsui is insistent on representing African history via a multiplicity of signifiers such as Nisbidi and Uli, symbols and ideograms, Akan and Adrinkas symbols, Nok and Benin references, it is to say not only that the old European paradigm of representing history are grossly inadequate, not only that, but they are also incapable of speaking with any resounding meaning to the malaise of our present ethical and philosophical consciousness. That's an Oakley way of explaining the world. That's his language. Such speaking, but the point he's making is that that kind of speaking is the primary purpose of art, of criticism, and of curating. So this is an intense struggle to realize a worldly purpose. It was indeed taking place, he said, in the field of contemporary African art, which very much includes artists of the diaspora, giving it, he says, in 1994, and I quote him again, an agency, a force, a vibrancy, and equally a tension that is unequaled in any other region of the world. 1994, that's the claim. So the new African art discourse, he fervently believed, would be based in locality and dislocation, would reach across cultures despite the evident barriers against so doing, would address the world whether it was ready or not. These values and this attitude would reverberate throughout the subsequent 25 years. So, sorry, there we go. I was showing you the first volume. This is the first half of the first volume. So Oakley did not only issue rhetorical calls for the renewal of African art discourse. As an art critic, he did the journeyman work that such a profession demands. He did interviews, participated in roundtables, he visited studios, wrote reviews in Frieze, in Art Forum, founded journals, obviously, got involved in debates, wrote catalogue essays, promoted the artists you admire, joined their cohort, become their spokesperson. There's essays on Frank Boulding, George Ariadbo, Ellen Gallagher, Lorna Simpson, Lynette Yadom-Buake, Glenn Ligon, Steve McQueen, Jean-Michel Basquiat, John Okomfor, and Nauri Ward in the two volumes, as you'll see as we go through. They represent a small sample of the, as I said, the 60 profiles of individual artists. I mean, the commitment that he produced, commitment is amazing. They insist that these cohorts of African, African-American, Black, British, Caribbean artists were making art of aesthetic value and social import that paralleled, even eclipses, that of their more celebrated contemporaries. His writings on these artists were unabashedly canon building. And this kind of energy and commitment to artists also informed, I think, his curating. It's crucial, as again we heard from Maria Magdalena Campos-Pons yesterday. He made commitments not only to artists early in their careers, but continued that. He made commitments to them at a certain point of their work, which perhaps they thought they'd achieved the best they could, but somehow or other, talking to him over time, the work turned out much better, much more powerful. He was not a hands-off curator in that sense. We've seen the impact of that in so many of his exhibitions. And if you look at his writings, they follow, every time they follow the artist's career. Every interview follows the artist's career from beginning to end. So amongst media, Oakley was committed very strongly, of course, to the history and exhibition of photography. He was acutely aware of how important documentary qualities of photography were to liberation movements in Africa, particularly the struggles against apartheid in South Africa. And he made many exhibitions on this subject. The first one obviously with Octavio Zaya, who was here, Insights African Photographers, 1940 to the present, Guggenheim 1996, continues all the way through the snap judgments, which concludes, the essay on the snap judgment show concludes the first volume. Other exhibitions such as, went all the way through, Archive Fever, also photography so important to him. Okay, so the post-national perspectives. Each of his landmark exhibitions, he wrote catalogue essays for them, which are themselves landmarks in thinking about their topics. All of those are included in the two volumes. Obviously, breakthrough curating of this time inevitably stirred controversy. How you set the right ratio between local interests and international developments is difficult. It's a perennial problem for biennials, but it's also their opportunity. It's their challenge. These dynamics can be found everywhere in contemporary art. It's necessary to its worldliness. In the case of Johannesburg in 1997, he's reacted to the previous edition in 1995, where curators from several countries are invited to make national exhibitions on the condition they included South African artists. Oakley thought this was provincialising, a way of transposing Venice to Johannesburg. So in Trade Routes, History and Geography in 1997, he showed the work of artists from 163 countries, including 35 South Africans. I hope you appreciate the caption commentary to the image on the left. It's quite a famous image. The one on the right is actually more interesting. So Oakley insisted on the priority of post-nationalist perspectives as a response to what he saw as the current situation in both South Africa and the world at large. Trade Routes attracted a lot of criticism for trying to celebrate post-nationalism in a country that just got rid of apartheid, struggling to rebuild itself as a nation. And the criticism was it imposed the most advanced models of international mega exhibitions in a city that had been isolated by sanctions for decades and was just beginning to build an art infrastructure. Oakley was unapologetic. In interviews, he praised the work of these two artists as amongst the few to fully manifest the contradictions he was talking about and trying to make clear. Second part of the first volume has these essays in it. Another great feature of his work was history lessons, not just thinking historically in the present, but actually remembering history, learning it and remembering it. Lessons in post-colonial history. He was influenced by historians such as Eric Hobsbawm, the history from below tendency represented by E.P. Thompson, and also someone I knew, Raphael Samuel, and the History Workshop movement in England. Most evident, of course, in the great Short Century exhibition in Munich, Chicago, and New York. Also, a kind of exhibition beyond that, the mega exhibition, the so-called global contemporary art exhibition. He wrote the definitive essay on this phenomenon, Mega Exhibitions, Antinomies of a Transnational Global Form, which of course is in the book. Documenter 11 embodied this phenomenon. As we know in his own words from the essay The Black Box, and I quote, "The collected result in the form of a series of volumes and the exhibition is placed at the dialectical intersection of contemporary art and culture. Such an intersection equally marks the liminal limits out of which the post-colonial, post-Cold War, post-ideological, transnational, deterritorialized, diasporic, global world has been written," which he did, as you've heard, movingly in the last few days with this amazing team of people. He went on to say, linked together, the exhibition counterposes the supposed purity and autonomy of the art object, which perhaps the politician on the right is wishing for, against a rethinking of modernity based in ideas of transculturality and extraterritoriality. So this leads to the key essay, which we've taken, the March meeting has taken it as its name, the Postcolonial Constellation. So his grasp of the key elements in global contemporary art is matched with similarly insightful analysis of the current geopolitical situation, especially its implications for ongoing struggle against old and new kinds of colonizations. These ideas arrive at their most complete expression in his 2003 essay, The Postcolonial Constellation, Contemporary Art in a State of Permanent Transition. So this is 10 years ago. He called on us to reject the view that the end of the Cold War meant that economist neoliberal globalization led by Western multinational companies and their political allies, would inevitably achieve total economic world-dominant cultural hegemony. That it would eradicate national and cultural differences, disable critique, make everything the same, dominate artistic possibility. Nonsense. On the contrary, these globalizing forces were elements within a larger, more complex set of geopolitical power arrangements, I'm quoting that were, quote, constellated around the norms of the post-colonial, those based on discontinuous, aleatory forms, on creolization, hybridization, and so forth, all of these tendencies operating with a specific cosmopolitan accent. He highlighted 5 effects of the post-colonial constellation on curators, artists, and art worlds everywhere. You see them here. Exhibitionary forms, messy profession, fraught contradictory experiences of decolonization, impact of heterogeneous art practice on the museum that can't absorb them all, cultures being heavily modified, and globalization, digital revolution is impacting on all of this. So this creates a kind of thinking historically in the present. And the impact of his thinking and thinking about the present has been profound. I could give multiple examples. Seeing I'm speaking, I'll just talk briefly about the examples, his impact on my own thought, just for 2 minutes, if you don't mind. Our collaboration was pivotal to my understanding of the messy, multi-layered shift from modern to contemporary art since the 1940s. This kind of shift has, went too far, go back one. Structured most of my recent writings, most of my books. 3 great currents, 3 great shifts from the 40s. Look at that as a kind of frame through the present, the flow of different kind of elements, 40s gradually replacing 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, down below. The flow of the contemporaneity is the flow of difference through time now, flows of differences together. And they not only manifest within art practice and in the interactions between these developments, where most artists actually live rather than inside them, they're also manifestations of a larger and deeper set of forces. This is thinking historically in the present. This is thinking about the ways in which we use reductive categories to try and explain the rest of the world. It's as if each one of these ideas is the sort of name of a city, and inside those ideas an incredible flow of other things occur. But we tend constantly to create large-scale world pictures and use words like the ones you see there for them. Oakley helped me understand that there's a whole set of continuing modernity concepts that when we try and world picture. But between these is dialectical oppositionality, which only resolves itself temporarily. Sometimes it's actually been troubled by this massive historical movement originating in many ways on this continent and many other colonized places that's put every nation into a state of transnational transitionality, which will continue, Oakley believed, onwards forever, interacting with the modernities of the colonizers. So that's operation there. I recognised he was less enthusiastic about the emphasis on contemporaneous difference and further cultures, digital cultures, new media and so on that's evolved, that I think is a third supplement to this whole operation. He didn't place a lot of value on that. For him, the politics of the dialectic between the first 2 currents were his focus. For him, the present remained a long way short of paying the historical debts incurred by a modernity that was still colonizing. This is thinking historically in the present. This is what he helped me do and many other people do. Okay, in the time remaining, I'll talk about the second volume, the essays collected in the second volume. That's a table of contents. Mainly we divided for practical and chronological reasons, but there is a change in Oakley's outlook that you can see in the years after 2000. It's less a matter of adopting a different point of view, but of expanding one that followed from the fact that some of the initial purposes of renewing African discourse had been successful. It had been renewed in important ways, long way to go, but still, it had been renewed and had its impacts everywhere. So on this world historical, geopolitical scale, neoliberalization may have been trying to emerge the dominant world picture, but as I said before, it was being profoundly challenged. And the top-down globalization apparent everywhere was in fact, particularly in the upper levels of the global art market, particularly for contemporary art, that kind of top-down globalization was being everywhere challenged by post-colonial activities. And this is the second set of essays in the second volume. A quick comment on biennials. Many of the essays were introductions to biennials, or they were about biennials as a phenomenon. Oakley consistently defended biennials against the frequent criticism that they'd become vehicles of globalization because the post-colonial condition, and now he shifts from constellation, this clustering, to a condition. He says that's become actually the world condition. Biennials had become place-making devices for articulating the empirical evidence of the imaginative practices of contemporary art across the world, not just in Western centres of power. There were occasions for curators to show how artists were responding, and I quote again, the dispersal of the old hegemonic claims of cultural authority that did not recognise difference. So if the second Johannesburg Biennale, the Short Century, etc., documented were pivotal mega exhibitions of the first phase, intense proximity, all the world's futures, and post-war were the landmarks of the second phase. So Oakley, so pleased to be appointed curator of the 56th Venice Biennale. Oakley at the Biennale, photographed by our dear mutual friend Hans Harker. Post-war, oops, sorry, it went too far. Post-war, the wonderful exhibition he did with Katie Siegel, Ulrich Williams, and others. So if intense proximity focused, include Damien Lentini is also here, big involvement in this work. If intense proximity focused on one core aspect of the post-colonial constellation, that's to say the accelerated, discomforting juxtaposition of different peoples, races, cultures, and classes, all the world's futures displayed it as the current world condition. And post-war traced its historical unfolding across vast tracts of the globe during its period. And remember, post-colonial 65 to 85, post-communist, that was the plan, 85 to who knows when, that was that kind of plan. That's the world historical movement and tracing. But however so-called global his perspective became, Oakley never lost focus on Africa. He continued to stage exhibitions that drew attention to its histories in the West, such as yet another great photo show at ICP in New York. He also continued to emphasize the achievement of artists of the African diaspora, such as Frank Bowling. Of course, I had to choose this one, Connecting Africa and Australia. He created a major retrospective of Bowling's work at the Haus der Kunst, in which he argued, as you see there, that he believed that it wasn't just a matter of uniting different aspects of the world, geographical places. It was a visual fusion of epic time and boundless space. This was the ambitions are getting bigger and wider. So, let's see. One second. It also applied to his way of thinking about African American artists, artists who operate on this level, if they came for us in the morning from the great Kerry James Marshall show at the Whitney. There were a couple of blind spots. He wasn't perfect. Despite the scale, scope, and depth of Oakwy's work, there were blind spots. Given the central place within contemporary art of work by women artists, the lesser presence in his publications is conspicuous. He wrote essays or conducted interviews with 21 women artists, in contrast to 77 male artists. Over the years, his exhibitions became more inclusive. Women artists were strongly present in the programming at the Haus der Kunst. When he did write about women artists, he did so, however, he did devote to its analysis the same degree and kind of thoroughness that can be found in his writings on male artists. In the books, essays on Lorna Simpson, Lynette Yardon-Boake, makes that clear, Ellen Geller in the earlier volumes. Indigenous art also remained all but invisible in his exhibitions and writings. Videos by Australian Aboriginal artist Destiny Deakin were shown in Documentary 11, as they are here, her much more recent work. Paintings by Emily Enwezor and Daniel Boyd, 2015. Emily Enwezor is showing here. My suggestion, he showed an historically significant bark painting by Wanjuk Marika in post-war. And I believe he was working, I didn't talk to him about this, on an exhibition to explore the conceptual dimensions of Indigenous art in relation to non-Indigenous conceptions of the savage mind, terrible term. So in retrospect and conclusion, in conversation with Masilimiano, forgive me, Masilimiano Joni, on the occasion of the Ngāri Ward exhibition, We the People, at the New Museum in New York in 2019, Oakwy was asked to recall the years around 1990 when he and that artist were part of the same scene. He replied, I quote him, "I wasn't an artist or an art critic or a curator. I was a writer, an aspiring writer, and a poet, you could say, doing the rounds of poetry readings, art galleries, and museums. We," that includes Octavio here, "haunted Soho galleries and Lower East Side dives, intensely writing, reading, looking, and in the jargon of the time, interrogating the power relations, the relations of power and domination. Those were halcyon days, but important to my formation 30 years ago." So in the last exhibition before his death, the last exhibition shown after his death, but conceived by him, he returned to those days, but in a very different world. It had changed. Grief and grievance, mourning, art and mourning in America, to 2020. Its fulcrum, as he put it, was, and I quote, "the crystallization of black grief in the face of a politically orchestrated white grievance that was, in effect, this is Black Lives Matter, facing down Trumpian white nationalism, the struggle that still goes on even more intensely in the United States right now." Another scene from the exhibition. So I've entitled my introduction about Oakwy, "A Certain Magnificence." This is the last photograph of Oakwy I can bear to look at. I can't look at any photograph of him taken after this time. So Chica took this photograph. Excuse me. I place it next to an image from his penultimate exhibition on view of the Haus der Kunst, a few miles away from the hospital where he died on March the 15th. Louise and I were there. day before, as Chicas introduced the exhibition. So El Enwezor Triumphant Scale was co-curated with Chica, who took the photograph 4 years earlier. Those of us who were at that exhibition were profoundly moved to witness Oakley giving the last of his energies to an exhibition he could not see and to a catalogue he could not finish writing. But in one sense, the circle had closed. He returned to Africa, to an Africa to which he remained committed, and to a Nigeria to which he never felt nostalgia, but where he willed his body to be buried amongst his family at Calabar. So in every other sense, however, his legacy remains an open work in progress across multi-layered platforms for the many worlds to come. All of them will be post-colonial. The subtitle for the El Enwezor retrospective, I think, is entirely befitting of that artist's breakthrough achievement. So and we hope, those of us who worked on these volumes, we hope that in these volumes and in the exhibitions and the arts infrastructure building he did throughout his life, we hope that you might be led to think that a certain magnificence of scale also marks the multifarious practice of Oakley and Enwezor. I thank you for listening. Okay, so Maria, I'm happy to take questions or comments, if you haven't any. Take your time, yeah.
Now Q&A.
Well, that was somebody who's talking loudly.
Thank you, Professor Smith. My name is Elizabeth Georges. I'm from the Africa Institute, and I'm an art historian. I'm right here. Can you see me? I'm right here. I'm an art historian, and thank you for Hur Al-Qasimi and Salah Hassan for bringing Oakley into this conversation. I was first introduced to Oakley's work in PS1 when he did the Short Century exhibition. I was not in the art world then, but the audacity of that exhibition still remains, still resonates in me to this day. And I have invited Oakley to Ethiopia a couple of times. Oakley is a very accessible guy, and so his scholarship, I've tried to introduce his scholarship in Ethiopia where I taught for many years. My question is, okay, Oakley, for most of us art historians who are educated abroad, he fundamentally changed our outlook and how we look at African modernism, African art, and so on. But Oakley is not really well known in the continent, except for some areas like probably Nigeria or South Africa, maybe, but not really. He's not really relevant, and not relevant, I don't want to say relevant, but he's not really well known. His scholarship is not well known in the continent, as far as I know. So, books like this are very important, not only to be distributed in the diasporic space, but also in the continent itself, really, because Oakley's conversation was about the continent, was about Africa. So, is there some how are we going to access how can we distribute books like this, Oakley's book, in the continent itself? Is there some thought behind that? Otherwise, it'll be like any other book published in the diasporic north, and it'll remain there, so nothing relevant. We talk about the African post-colonial, but if the African post-colonial doesn't really negotiate the post-colonial in the continent, it doesn't make sense. Maria's talk yesterday was Magda's talk yesterday was I was so taken aback because I was so mesmerized by it because she brought Okwi into her own personal experience and as an artist, from Johannesburg Biennial up to, the days that, up to the contemporary time, how she related to Okwi's philosophy. So these are the same kind of these are the same kinds of things that we want to instill in African artists in the continent. So I don't know if I'm rambling, but I'm just asking how can Okwi be accessible in the continent what he was concerned about, So I think I should stop here.
Okay, I'm sorry, I actually didn't get a question. I got an interesting statement. Thank you for elaborating what I said, but I didn't actually hear a clear question. Can you just repeat your last sentence again?
I just said, for most of us who learned art history or who had, who were involved in African modernist art historical studies in the diaspora, Okwi was very accessible. And he shaped most of our thoughts. Yeah. And I'm really indebted to that. And the first time, like I said, I was introduced to him was at the PS1 Short Century exhibition. And from then on, I only think along those lines, along Okwi's lines, and I feel indebted to him. But he's not really visible in the continent. Okwi, not too many art institutions know Okwi and Enwezor, except maybe for some places like South Africa, Nigeria maybe, because he's from there, and just limited spaces. So how do we get Okwi in the continent? This book is very important, but if it's going to be just marketed in the north, it doesn't make sense. How do we get him into the continent and revive Okwi's philosophy again in the continent? That's what I did.
So I think I've picked up a thread, which is Okwi was not a trained art historian. His writings, as you said, were crucial for practitioners and curators. They haven't been as available or absorbed by art historians of modern and contemporary art, to the degree that they deserve to be. That's why we're doing these books, obviously. He did, in fact, receive a lot of recognition from art history institutions, such as the Institute of Fine Arts in New York, where he taught for a while, taught in Pittsburgh with us. He taught in many different places. But you're right in the sense that his writings, which I think, and we think are crucial to how we think the shifts from different kinds of modernities into what I call the conditions of contemporaneity. They're pivotal. And what I hope to have briefly shown you halfway through my lecture was the way in which his thinking fed into what I think are the most expanded ways of thinking about transitions from modern to contemporary art that are occurring. I've noticed some essays by James Meyer, who's here, that obviously respond to Okwi's writings. David Josselett does so in his book, Heritage and Debt. So the few of us who are trying to think on a broader scale about these things do respond to his work. Let's hope that when these volumes are out, everybody will have to respond. You can't avoid the intellectual contribution to art history, amongst other things, of Okwi and Enwezor. Any more? Yep, there's a hand up over here.
My question is that...
Okay, thank you so much. This was enlightening. I'm a literary critic, so this question may be unfair. What was his take on the repatriation of object arts? Did he have a specific stand that you can elaborate on that conversation?
If I'm correct, the question was about his take on repatriation?
That's right.
Okay. I cannot recall, in all the things I looked at, him making a statement about that. But that may be something I've omitted. That may be me. That may be something I've omitted. Conversationally, he was, of course, supportive. But others here may have a clearer answer. But I'm not going to say he believes this or that. I only have conversational evidence. I don't remember a text. Before we go on to another question, is anyone who knew Okwe's views on that matter in the building and can share them with us? Any hands going up? Yes, Louise? Yeah, please.
Okay, my...
Thank you. 1 second.
Louise Neary. I was Okwe's partner at the time of his death, but more importantly, I wanted to say that I'm sure that this question is going to be answered in detail in Sunday's session, and that probably all thought should be suspended until then. But if anyone, that just before Okwe died, he actually participated in a symposium that was held and organized by the Goethe Institute on this very question, and it was the last time that Okwe ever appeared on camera, and that video is not widely available, but he gave a very, very specific response in formation about the whole question of restitution and repatriation, and I can't relate it verbatim, but one of the things that he said, which was with a certain level of wry humor, was the idea of permanent loans, and the idea that loans should be, or that objects in foreign museums should always be cited as a beginning could be the idea of the permanent loan, not in the collection of. And it was a really wonderful statement, but it was only a very small part of this quite pointed and provocative address that he gave at the end of his life. And I think that the Goethe Institute would be very willing to share that statement.
That's a great concept, that every work of art,
thank you,
not in its place of origin, is on permanent loan to that place, if at all. I think there was a gentleman there, and I think Uta has. Long-term loan, not permanent, long-term, sorry. Okay, great.
Yeah. I don't know if it's my chance. This way. Terry. Salah, it's okay. No, I only just wanted to comment on the question of Elizabeth George's about accessibility. I think that the question has two sides. One is really the practical issue, which is the inequalities in terms of distribution of knowledge and in relation to knowledge production. Books by Duke and others are definitely very expensive and not easy to distribute. And even magazines and others that are accessible online, they cost a lot for the African students or even professors and so forth. And that's a real issue. I mean, of course, these are actually a result of or compounded more by the crisis of the post-colonial state in the continent. In some places, there is accessibility. South African universities and so forth are in better shape than in other places. American University in Cairo, others has good library. But I think this is something that we also faced in the African Study Association Award when we realized that all the books that come for award, I was a member of the award in the book, the so-called Herskovits one, long time ago. It's the book award of the African Study Association. We found that 99% almost of the books that win award or that are submitted for awards are actually from Duke, Cambridge, Indiana, Ohio. And if you look at the list of the people who won, prizes are almost from these kind of 5 or 6, presses. So I think the issue is much more complex, and I think what may be on the practical level Elizabeth and me and many others will ask for is that part of the negotiation with Dukes would be that this book becomes accessible online for people within the continent. And that's the only thing that
Very short. He did a fantastic job because maybe for first time he opened the art world to another country, and he broke the hegemony from the West to the another. But the problem was that it was very simple and surface to have a little that a stereotype to characterize it for art from another country to work in the show. You see, this is from Iran and this is from Africa, just to get that this is from another. It was not really deep, too philosophical, to have the time to go in and to see something deeper from another country. You know what I'm talking? Is that easier, very easier to get surface from traditional. For example, the cliches come from, calligraphy come from Arabic, carpet come from Iranian, and it was the face from another country in this show that with the name Global Art that was very simple, not very working on it to get the different as traditional what we know from every country.
Let me, if I could, take that as a comment. That's the purpose of biennials and mega exhibitions, post-colonial exhibitions of the kind that we're talking about. So I thank you very much. I think Maria wants to wrap up the session so we can go on to the next one. Thank you.